Here we go. Let's get into it.
All right.
All right. Welcome everybody to New Layer, a podcast about design, craft, and culture. My name is Aaron Lalau.
And I'm Yuriy.
And welcome to Layer 1, the first episode of this New Layer podcast. Basically, the overall thought of this podcast is every week we'll be talking about a new layer, a new aspect of design and the design profession and kind of the culture around it. And so we were kind of thinking like, what would make a great first episode, a great Layer 1? And we kind of landed on the topic of design crit or design feedback. And yeah, so Yuriy, why? Maybe we can kind of like explain to the listeners why we decided feedback would make a good first layer.
Oh man, yeah. So for the base layer, if you were to think of all the design skills you need, for pretty much any design career, feedback is, I think, one of the ones that translates to all design industries or disciplines. So whether you're like an architect or you're designing, a medical device or something like that. You need that basic skill of collecting and giving feedback pretty much on like a weekly basis if you're going to do design work. So we thought like, where should we start from? What's the baseline skill? What's the most like essential, important thing that we can build on?
Yeah, and I also think it's like also a really important part of the design profession. Like no matter what you're doing, you're gonna have collaborators. They might not be other designers. They might be engineers or product people or clients. And so being able to get feedback from people to make what you're building or designing better and to contribute together to this final product is kind of an essential part.
Yeah, there's so much there too. We could keep going for layers and layers, episodes and episodes about like the types of feedback that you get from personal feedback to, presenting the right way. But we're just going to dive into some questions and let you know how we think about feedback and hopefully start a conversation about feedback in general. And we definitely want to hear from you. So after the show, just give us some pointers on Instagram or Twitter. Details are below in the description. So Aaron, I got a question for you. So of all the feedback you've ever gotten as a designer, what's like the worst feedback you've ever received?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a specific moment stands out to me, and I'll preface this by saying, sorry, Mom, for the strong language, but I remember this incident when I was actually a pretty junior designer, and I got the feedback from a pretty senior designer on the team, and that was verbatim, "This UI is shit."
Wow.
This looks like someone took a shit on my phone.
Oh my God.
And I mean, in retrospect, he was kind of right. The design could have been a bit stronger. It wasn't necessarily solving the problem that it needed to, but obviously that was not very actionable feedback. That feedback could have been a lot better. And I think I kind of took two things away from that experience. Like one, not everyone is going to have the right vocabulary to describe why a design probably isn't meeting its goals or its aesthetic tastes. So that's on like how to give good feedback, but also for me presenting my work, I could have structured that meeting in a much better way so that I didn't get such kind of off the wall, unsolicited feedback on what I was presenting.
Wow, man, I don't know how I'd even take that kind of feedback. Like somebody tells me my work is total shit.
Well, how about you, Yuriy? What's kind of the worst feedback? I'm sure no one's ever told you that your UI looks like shit because the stuff that you make is just so flawless.
I mean,
every time
yeah, like it's kind of, I'm kind of good, man. I'm sorry, but I just never get
never get negative feedback at all.
Yeah, but for real, I've never gotten combative feedback like that. And it's never really been personal for me. So like feedback's never divulged into something that's like super personal or like almost like someone attacking me.
Yeah.
But the one thing I will say about the bad type of feedback that I got or the worst type of feedback that I get on a regular basis is the feedback that leaves me with no actionable stuff. So I get the feedback. It's kind of like it's just amorphous. There's no information in there. Sometimes it's good feedback. Sometimes it's bad. It could be somebody praising my work, yet I have nothing to take away from it. So I've been fortunate enough to not have anybody like critique my work and like harsh language.
Yeah,
The people around me have been pretty good, but yeah, it's just the worst type of feedback I get when I get back to my desk and I'm like, crap, now what?
I guess if feedback is so important, like we said at the top of the show, Yuriy, how do you actually go about getting the right people to give you the right feedback at maybe the right time?
Well, Aaron, I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, I mean, man, that's a good question. Actually, the first thing to note about feedback of any kind, and you, dear designer, are probably listening because you're probably wondering, like, am I missing something in my feedback process? And what I'll say is mature design teams have a culture of feedback, and they have a forum for giving each other feedback. So, for example, this could be like an informal meeting where the teammates get together once a week and they show each other work in progress. Or it could be a formal meeting where you get together with design leads and show them stuff that's farther along so they can basically approve the process and let you like keep going and making that stuff a reality. But in all those cases, you need formal structured time so people can get together and actually like look at your stuff. And those meetings could be large or small. I prefer small because, with large meetings with feedback, like if you have too many stakeholders in the room, it's just really hard to collect everyone's thoughts. So you get the core people in the room who need to be there and structure that time. Make that time a formal piece on your calendar.
Yeah, actually, before we started recording this episode of the podcast, I was doing a bunch of reading about different articles, people giving advice on how to structure this meeting. And one of the best ones I came across was by Jake Knapp, in which he outlined 9 rules for structuring a really productive feedback session. And if I remember correctly, the first 2 were pretty important, which was just like basically identify the design owner, the person who's going to be presenting their work and ultimately getting the feedback. And 2 was identifying a facilitator, someone who can keep everyone on task, take all the notes for the presenter, and really just facilitate that process.
Man, Jake's such a rock star. He was a co-writer on co-author of the book Sprint. If you haven't checked it out, you should check it out. It's pretty cool.
We can put a link in the show notes as well.
Yeah, let's put a link below. That's a really good point. Identify the design owner and facilitator to help you organize your notes. Don't, lay the burden on yourself to take all those notes.
And also maybe just kicking people off their laptops, making everyone say, okay, everyone, laptops down, stop reading your email, get off Instagram, get off Twitter. And during this process, pay attention and give the good feedback.
All right, so let's just say you have a forum or a meeting set up. And so what are the things that you do to make sure that you get the best feedback possible? Like, how do you prepare?
I think before you even get into presenting any of your work, showing any of the mocks that you've made, very clearly stating the project goals. So saying, hey guys, this is what the project is, the problem that we're trying to solve today. This is maybe where we're at, say like we're just kicking off, we're already building stuff, I'm at this state of the process, and the kind of feedback that you actually want. So if you're saying like, hey, I'm not looking for visual design feedback, I'm not looking for motion design, I'm kind of just I would like to get some thoughts on the overall flow that I'm going through. Or you could be saying, hey guys, the flow is already locked down, we've got people building that, I'm looking for very specific feedback on this kind of thing. And hopefully the feedback that you get will actually be addressing those points that you outlined. So whether that's approvals or just more specific feedback on the different elements of the design.
That's cool. It sounds like you're like taking the time to organize your thoughts so that others don't have to. You're like saving time for all those people in that meeting.
Because you'll definitely get a ton of feedback from a lot of different people. I think some feedback that is going to be really, really important and maybe kind of have you rethink things. Some stuff that's just raising new questions and like, oh, I actually didn't think of that. Like I will have to go back and maybe do another iteration based on what you just asked.
There's actually one point that comes to mind is that when you're putting yourself out there and you're collecting all this feedback, a lot of the times you're going to get a lot of points that you don't know what to do with. Like some stuff is just not actionable. meaning that, you don't have to act on all the feedback. Sometimes when you're receiving a piece of feedback, you just thank the person giving feedback, write it down.
Mind, like, I'm never going to do that shit.
Yeah, like really. I mean, that's straight up how you should treat some of the feedback. And it's hard as a junior designer because you have people who are more senior than you giving you well-structured, probably, good pointers.
Yeah.
And then you come back to your desk and you're like, well, no, what should I do with this? And just remember that you don't have to address all of the feedback. Sometimes you want to address it afterwards in like Sketch or Photoshop, but you don't have to address it during the meeting. Thank them, write it down, let it go, be zen about it.
Yeah, move on. So one thing I find that I struggle with when I'm presenting my work is just I fall into this trap of that I want to sell it as good as possible. Like, I've spent so much time thinking about this problem. I'm probably pretty confident in the solution that I came up with. And so rather than kind of going in there honestly and being like, let's expose all the flaws in this potential thing, I'm basically trying to sell it to the other designers in the room. Like, they're my clients, like maybe putting together some sort of really sexy prototype or video or something like that. That just really kind of is more of like a hype or promotional material than it is actually explaining how the thing works really well.
I mean, your work is really polished, so, I can't fault you for that. It's like really good. But I guess one of the things that give away something as a sales pitch is if you're only presenting one concept as opposed to like 5 concepts, and letting the crowd decide. If you're only presenting one thing, you may get stuck with just everybody critiquing that one thing and then later digging in.
Well, I also found, if you present just one really polished thing, usually there's maybe some alternatives to solving that problem that if you don't present them or don't acknowledge them, usually the other designers in the room might be already designing in their minds the perfect solution, and that's maybe not right for the right solutions, but because you didn't talk about it, you only showed this one really polished one. People might be veering off on that alternative path.
So I guess if you had some of these solutions in your back pocket, something like if you're doing slides, you can have it in the appendix, or you can have them in your sketch file.
Ooh, that appendix is a good move.
Yeah, and then you just say, that's a great point you made there in your feedback. Let me show you that iteration or why that didn't work. Because if you speak to why something didn't work, it may take you longer to speak to it than just show the thing.
Yeah. And you're just hit them with the appendix. I guess the problem is if you try and show every iteration, every problem up front before you get to the right solution. Like, I think one person told me at one time, don't present work that you don't think you can launch or you don't think is good, you don't think is the right solution.
That's the classic a design agency thing is you never present work that you don't want the client to fall in love with.
If you give them like 3 options and one of them you really actually don't like, they're going to pick that option.
Yeah, and they're going to be like, you know what? I think we have a winner. And it's going to be hard to talk them off that cliff.
Yeah, so maybe it's not presenting it as options, but just showing like to other people in your team in the process, being like, here's some of the things I got to on the way to what I think is the right solution. So we can just acknowledge those, move past it. But don't show anything that is totally just the wrong solution. Yeah. Okay, I guess speaking of all of these people giving you feedback, on the other side of the table, how do you kind of approach being a good audience member in these crit sessions? How do you make sure that the feedback that you're giving is well thought out and well structured and not just all over the place?
Oh man, we can do a whole other layer on that because
another layer, another one.
Oh man, all of these things, right? You can go really deep on the layers because this is also a bit of an art form. As you read the room or as you read the presenter, or as you're giving your presentation, you're reading the audience. Yeah, you have to almost tailor your questions or your feedback to them, and this is obviously depends on each team, on the culture of each team. But if you ask lots of questions, if you, instead of saying, for example, hey, you really should do this, and then you should do this, and that'll make it a good design, you can rephrase that exact same feedback in saying like, hey, have you thought about doing this? Or what if we do this? Yeah. And then you basically open up the door for them to to come up with their own solution without being too prescriptive.
I think just also just asking lots of questions in general, maybe turning something that you think might be the solution into a question might actually expose. So if you say, oh, you should do this, if you change it to, hey, did you think about doing this? They might actually bring up why they had thought about that and why it might not be the right solution. So you can kind of save face a little bit and saying like, here's the solution, but it's actually not the right one for those number of reasons.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that actually, you end up learning a lot in feedback sessions, like sitting into them.
One thing that I think is maybe a little bit of a cliche that a lot of people bring up is the feedback sandwich, or the shit sandwich, so to speak, in which you say something positive first and you put kind of the more critical feedback or constructive feedback in the middle and finish it with something positive at the end.
Some of that sandwich, yeah.
I feel like I can tell when someone is shit sandwiching me now, if they just come out the gate being like, I really like your design and blah, blah, blah. Like, first of all, whether you like it or not is kind of a mute point.
That's just another layer is this shit sandwich. It's like a whole other art form right there. We're just revealing, we just made 3 different episode ideas right here.
But do you know what I mean? It's not important whether or not you like it. But if you say, okay, here's what I think about this design is really strong, and here's the parts that could be worked on, and here's some encouragement. That's kind of the right way to, I guess, give the shit sandwich. Sure, but if it's just like, I really like this, and then here's some harsh feedback, and like, go team, like.
But even if what you're saying is totally correct, but there's a very strong psychological kind of like chain reaction that takes place no matter how you deliver the shit sandwich. Is like, when you give somebody some positive feedback, they automatically know that you don't hate them, or you don't hate the design, or that you think that they've spent a good amount of time. You're just basically acknowledging that that their work matters, and that alone can just ease the feedback cycle. So like in a sense, like, it really depends on the relationship. If you're just like bullshitting between each other, it's like, dude, I don't think that works. You just skip the whole salami there, and you gave me all the terrible sauce,
Yeah.
And so now I'm like, okay, so now I have to evaluate, like, are you saying that because you just sort of like are frustrated and you're out of time, or are you just genuinely like, giving your honest opinion and it's no big deal? So yeah, shit sandwiches work.
Another thing that I think probably sounds super obvious, but actually is super important as an audience member, is just to take lots of notes. I find myself, my mind wandering, daydreaming, thinking about my own project, thinking about checking email, refreshing Twitter while someone else is presenting. But if I really just have pen in hand and I'm taking notes while they're presenting, I can remember things about the presentation better and ultimately give much better feedback. Also, as I'm taking notes, usually like a question will pop up that the presenter might get to a minute or two later. So rather than interrupting them, sticking my hand up, asking that question, they'll answer that later. And then finally, I guess, when it comes time for me to actually, voice my opinions and give that feedback, there's a good chance I'm not going to get to all the things that I thought of. So maybe if it's appropriate, after the person is presenting, I can, pass them my note sheet or sticky notes, or follow up with them afterwards, a couple of questions that I might have had, which I would definitely forget if I wasn't actually writing it down myself.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And sometimes I found myself in the meeting like trying to not forget what I was going to say to them instead of listening to them.
Yeah.
And as soon as that thought is on paper, I'm right back in their presentation, and I'm not super worried about forgetting what I was going to say. I just let that thought sort of go, and I'm just way more present if I'm writing. I internalize it way better.
Yeah.
I think one of the points that Jake Knapp wrote in his list is like not to design in the meeting. That one really stood out to me because that one, I don't think that's a hard and fast rule. Like if you're in that meeting and somebody wants to get up in front of a whiteboard and give you a solution, that's cool. Sometimes that's such an awesome like gift to you that you can take away, and they're very concrete. I sometimes even ask people to draw their ideas. Like if it's not clear what they're saying in my feedback, it's like, dude, can you just go and draw this on the whiteboard? And they do, and it actually really, really helps. But this rule, I think, is a huge balance in terms of time management. So as I do that, note to self, got to keep track of that time. So if you open the door to designing in the meeting, you're essentially opening the door for everybody to lay into that design. And you may run out of time to present stuff you wanted to present in the first place.
I just think it's so risky opening up that door. It could so easily snowball off into some tangent, and we get a lot of people who are just maybe coming into this problem for the first time, just basically having a brainstorm session about the solution. I guess it really depends on where you are in the design process and whether that or not that's the right kind of feedback.
Great point. You got to read that room, yeah.
But in terms of actually giving the feedback, what do you think are like some basic rules for what makes good or bad feedback?
Yeah, I mean, the bad feedback focuses on a very tactical point in the solution where you may be still talking about the merits of the problem or like whether everybody agrees. So this is why it's at the beginning of the presentation, it's important to like nail down that problem statement, really, really state your goals and make sure the whole room sort of gets time to agree on that, and then you move forward. But when somebody is drilling down into a solution, it's not necessarily bad. It's just that you as the presenter have to pull them back and use the problem as like your sword and shield.
Right.
Just so like you have to deflect all this type of non-relevant feedback. And I don't think I've ever had a problem going back to the problem and saying like, oh, this solution sounds like it would solve this type of problem, but the problem we're trying to solve is actually like this. Do you think that's correct? Should we still be going after this? Or do you think the problem you outlined is more so important? And that actually opens up a really, really meaningful discussion most of the time. So, yeah.
I think going back to the example I kind of gave earlier about this UI is shit, is a lot of bad feedback also tends to center on, the designer and not the design. Mm-hmm. So even though he was saying this design is shit, it kind of felt like a personal attack.
Yeah, you know what I mean? It's like, you're not very good at this.
Rather than saying, here's the objective shortcomings of the design, and here's how I think we could make it better. So I think, and maybe a third thing I would add is like, you can't just come with criticism. You also need to try and come with some solutions as well. So not just saying this is bad for these reasons, but also saying, here's how I think we could think about making it better.
Yeah.
Or have you tried this? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Have you tried this? Yeah, that's a really good one. Phrasing as have you tried this, and not so much, hey, you should do this. There is something to be said about like a mix of levels in the design meeting, and this is especially hard for young designers who are just trying to prove themselves. They're trying to say like to the room, hey, I'm actually good. Like I'm actually good, and I spent a lot of time on this. And they are looking for some personal validation, so that negative feedback or less tactful feedback hits them really hard, and that's something that you, dear designer, should just be aware of. I think at any level, any kind of personal feedback hits you really hard.
Definitely.
Yeah. That's one thing about our industry. What did Kanye say in his interview? I think highly sensitive individuals, HSI or something like that.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
Highly sensitive people as artists.
Yeah.
And design holds this place between like art and craft, I guess, where people are, you do put in a lot into your work. So feedback, when it's delivered wrong, can really, really trigger a lot of bad feelings.
And I guess as it all wraps up, as you've gone through this roller coaster of presenting your work and maybe getting some feedback that you didn't intend for or you didn't ask for, at the end of the day, what do you like to leave a meeting with as a designer, as a presenter?
I like to leave with a beer and just slam it right after the meeting.
Just ship it. Yeah. Everything is approved. You're good.
So no, I'm just kidding. I'd want to leave with like an action list. Like I said at the beginning, the worst thing I can get is coming back to my desk and feeling more behind in my work or unclear about what to do.
Yeah.
And then there's a certain amount of like anxiety and going back to the stakeholders and being like, hey, look, you said this, but I wasn't super clear about this. That just means you didn't really, structure your meeting well. What I like to leave is with an action list, and then let everybody know, ideally before the meeting ends or right after the meeting, is like what I'm about to do. Like we mentioned earlier, you don't have to address everybody's feedback. You could note it, say like, oh, you said this, but you don't have to like design around it necessarily. But just let people know what you're about to do. What are your next steps? They could be, they don't have to be super precise. They could be a little bit vague, because in the moment you may overpromise to do something that you're not about to do. And I do this wholeheartedly. I'm like, I'm going to do this and this. I'm going to redesign this flow. I'm going to redesign this app.
Like when you're recapping the meeting,
I'm going to quit drinking a beer. And then you sit there and you're like, oh yeah, I'm probably not going to do that. So being a little bit more general with your takeaways is good. But just letting people know that you have next steps in mind, and that you're going to come back for a certain amount of feedback, or so that people who gave you that time and gave you their energy also have a little bit of closure. So you acknowledge their effort as well.
Yeah, I think from like very clear steps of what you should do next, and maybe a time for when you can reconvene and follow up on that. Really good things to leave with. And then I think also just in the best circumstances, when I feel like I've left with something really good, is kind of just like at a more genuine level, inspiration and encouragement. So maybe someone said, have you thought about this? Or did you try this? And I might actually get inspired to go try that new thing and think about something in a new way. Or if that didn't happen, just encouragement, to say that, hey, I know what you're doing is difficult. It goes back to the shit sandwich that we were talking about earlier.
Man, that's so true.
Of like walking away with, just we're all in this together, full steam ahead, keep attacking the problem.
Yeah. That those words are so valuable. Like when I hear that at the end of a critique, I really do feel good about, even if I have to go back and rethink everything.
Sure.
I really feel good about like the time I've spent so far. Like, the journey feels worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other kind of last tips that you have for presenting your work, giving feedback on work, talking about work in a meaningful way?
Yeah, actually what comes to mind is, I keep referencing this presentation by Mike Montero. He did a keynote at IXDA 2016. I haven't actually have dropped in on that presentation. And Mike talked about, being there in the room, like showing up to and presenting your work, not just being like dubbed a creative, but also having presentation skills and really like, he says it's selling design. I'm a little allergic to the word selling, but it is so true what he said. It's being there in the room, presenting the work, making sure that the work gets presented how you want to present it,
right,
and then being there to receive the feedback of the work. In a lot of design agencies, there's a lot of layers between you and the client, and sometimes you're going to be relegated to be back at the office while your work is getting presented for you. Now that really depends on your circumstances, but my advice to pretty much anybody is to try to cut through those layers and be there in the room when that feedback gets presented, instead of receiving that feedback firsthand. So really just be at the table. Like make sure Definitely, that your designs are either presented by you in the best case scenario, or even if you're not presenting, be there in the room to like really understand where the feedback is coming from, because so much misinterpretation and back and forth can happen from missing a ton of context.
Yeah, I think agencies are kind of notorious for this kind of work, where maybe you're one of the creatives making the solution and it gets presented by your manager. But I think it also happens pretty frequently in larger tech companies as well, where maybe you're not the one presenting the work, but say your colleague in product is. Especially, I see a lot of maybe your colleagues in product presenting research findings, and maybe the researchers aren't in the room rather. when they're just as much a contributor to the UX process. So I think, just getting a seat at the table, like that's a pretty meaty subject, something that we could probably follow up on another layer of the New Layer podcast.
The seat at the table has been a hotly discussed topic. But for now, we're just going to leave you with some of these nuggets, and we hope you can take these away to your design desks and beyond and use them.
So speaking of feedback, we're pretty new to this whole podcast thing. So if you have any questions, thoughts, ideas for new topics, for
sandwich recipes,
we'd like to hear those too. Ideas for new topics for the New Layer podcast, we'd really appreciate it. So feel free to comment below on YouTube or hit us up at New Layer 1 on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks for listening, everyone.
See you in the next one.
Nice.
Yeah.
It keeps me a lot more focused, so I can actually give better feedback. Also, dude, Jesus Christ, just your smirk.
Just what I'm writing down right now is notes equals life, focus equals key.
Okay, take 6.
Oh,
I'm good. It's gonna get better and better. Okay, here we go.